The National Disability Insurance Scheme, or NDIS, was once a groundbreaking reform in disability care, an initiative that promised personalized support, choice, and dignity for people with disabilities. But today, it is finding itself in a very difficult spot, with the recent legislative changes and stricter interpretations of funding rules are causing deep distress for participants. What I want to share with you today are very real stories that show the human impact of these legislative changes. They're publicly reported, but they're just the tip of the iceberg. Providers like myself are encountering similar cases, and the number of these stories is growing at an alarming rate. Hi, I'm Lucia. I'm a support coordinator from True Support team here in Melbourne. If you find these discussions meaningful, please subscribe to this channel. To everyone who has already subscribed, thank you so much for your ongoing support. So let's dive into today's topic. So a recent example which illustrates just how devastating these cuts in NDIS funding can be was reported by The Advertiser. The story featured a 4-year-old boy with autism who has made remarkable progress through music therapy funded by the NDIS. His parents described the therapy as life-changing, helping him communicate and express himself in ways they never thought possible. For their son, music therapy is a vital tool that allowed him to develop language, social, and emotional skills. Without it, however, the parents fear that he could lose the progress he's made and regress to a point where communication becomes nearly impossible again. With the recent changes to NDIS funding rules, therapies like music therapy and art therapy are being categorized as non-NDIS supports and deemed ineligible for funding under the NDIS. And the family is now left wondering how are they going to afford these critical sessions for their son out of pocket. You can hear a quick unpacking of the recent NDIS changes in my previous video, and the link should pop up somewhere at the top of the screen here. So back to this story. It is an example of a prominent reminder of how these funding cuts impact families at a deeply personal level. This family, like so many others, has been left to fight a system that feels increasingly focused on saving money rather than supporting participants. It raises a very important question. How can a system designed to empower people with disability justify removing supports that clearly work? Let's look at another example. The article from Adelaide Now tells the story of an Adelaide family facing severe financial and emotional hardship after the NDIS significantly reduced supports funding for their daughter, who has intellectual disability. The family had been relying on NDIS funding for essential care, which allowed them to balance their work commitments and provide for their daughter's complex needs. However, the funding cuts that they have experienced left them unable to hire the 2 support workers recommended by the medical professionals to care for their daughter. This decision, justified by the NDIA as not being value for money, forced the parents to shut down their smoothie bar business, which they had invested over $100,000 into. And unfortunately for this family, the loss of income has pushed them to the brink of financial ruin and potential homelessness. The parents described the NDIS process as frustrating and unresponsive, with little regard for the evidence they submitted to justify their funding request. They expressed a despair over the lack of support, saying it feels like the system is failing their daughter. This really highlights the effect that the NDIS funding cuts can have, not only on participants but also on their families, who are, in this case, left to figure out how to support their child going forward while also being on the brink of financial ruin. It's a very scary thought that a government program can change so quickly and so rapidly and have such a deep effect because of it. I would like to share with you another story. This is an article that was reported by news.com.au. It features a 36-year-old woman suffering from psoriatic arthritis, a debilitating condition that affects her mobility and overall health. She has been left frustrated by the NDIA's decision-making. Her condition has led to multiple strokes, heart attacks, and forced her into early medical retirement. Despite receiving quite a good funding package, the woman's requests for critical home modifications were denied. These modifications, which are necessary to help her live safely and independently in her own house, include adjustments to accommodate her mobility issues such as a wheelchair ramp and widened door frames. Without these modifications, her living conditions are reported to be unsafe and unsanitary, further exacerbating her health challenges. Instead of approving these essential supports for home modifications, the NDIA allocated funds towards activities this woman describes as unnecessary for her current needs, such as social outings. Because of this, she has been forced to consider selling her home, as the home modifications she really needs are unaffordable without NDIS support. The woman stated that her experience dealing with NDIA has left her feeling abandoned by a system she believes is inefficient and focused on bureaucracy rather than practical individual outcomes. These stories are just a few of many. As providers, we've seen these kinds of cases multiply. Families once felt empowered by the NDIS are now feeling abandoned. Participants who relied on consistent funding for years are finding themselves blindsided by sudden cuts, which can sometimes come out of the blue. These stories also highlight systemic issues within the NDIS, including inefficient use of funds, disregard to person support needs, and a lack of person-centered decision-making. The changes have created an environment of fear and uncertainty. Participants are anxious every time their plans come up for review, worried that they'll lose supports they can't live without. And of course, providers are spending more time advocating for the participants through internal reviews and appeals at the tribunal. So why is this happening? Well, the government has made it clear that these changes are about sustainability. Earlier this year, the federal government has made no secret of its intention to reduce the cost of the NDIS. In the 2024 federal budget, the Treasurer announced a plan to save $74 billion over the next decade by tightening the scheme's funding rules and focusing on sustainability. This announcement came alongside a broader fiscal strategy aimed at achieving a budget surplus, with the NDIS as one of the primary areas for significant cost reductions. Specifically, the government pledged to cap the annual growth of NDIS spending at 8% by 2026, down from the current growth rate of over 14%. Stay with me, I will break these down shortly. While 8% may sound like a reasonable target, it translates into billions of dollars in reduced funding year on year. For context, end of 2024 financial year, which ended on June 30th, 2024, the NDIS budget was projected to reach $40 billion. Reducing the growth rate means that many supports participants currently rely on will inevitably face closer scrutiny of what constitutes an NDIS supports. They will also face tighter eligibility requirements, outright denials, and funding cuts. The government has also allocated $720 million over 4 years to stricter enforcement of funding rules. This includes measures to clamp down on what the NDIA considers as non-disability related supports, streamline the approval process for lower-cost solutions, and introduce stricter interpretations of what is deemed reasonable and necessary supports. To understand the magnitude of these cuts, let's break it down. $74 billion over 10 years. This figure is representing a structural shift in how the scheme operates. Saving $7.4 billion annually on average means significantly fewer supports approved, regardless of whether participants have relied on them for years. 8% spending growth cap. This cap represents a drastic reduction in how quick the government wants the NDIS scheme to grow compared to the current trajectory. For a program supporting hundreds of thousands of participants, at this stage it's 661,000 of participants, slowing growth at this rate risks creating a gap between what participants need and what the scheme actually can provide. $720 million towards enforcement fund. While presented as a way to make the system more efficient, this fund is largely about auditing, rejecting, and reassessing participants' plans. It does come off as a deliberate move to tighten the purse strings and not to improve participants' outcomes. So what do these numbers mean for the participants? It means that families like those raising children with autism, adults with physical disabilities, and participants relying on home modifications are now caught in the middle of a budgetary agenda. And it possibly means more frequent request denials, internal review denials, and being forced into appeals processes that are lengthy and emotionally draining, and frankly, dehumanizing. For providers, these changes mean an increase in rejected invoices, endless paperwork to justify supports, and supporting participants through appeals. The 720 million mark for stricter compliance means participants will face even more barriers to accessing what they need, while the NDIA invests into a system to enforce denials rather than facilitate care. So why do these cuts matter? The government frames these measures as necessary to ensure NDIS remains viable for the future generations. But the current approach doesn't reflect long-term thinking. Cuts to early intervention therapies, personal care, or home modifications may save money in the short term, but they often lead to more expensive crises down the line, like hospital admissions, mental health deteriorations, and premature moves to aged care. For the participants, unfortunately, the message is clear. Fewer supports, more scrutiny, and a growing sense that the system is less about meeting the need and more about controlling costs. The NDIS was never meant to be a cost-cutting exercise. It was designed as a social contract, a promise that Australians with disabilities would be given the resources they need to live with dignity and independence. Alright, while we have explored some of the challenges within the NDIS, it's also important to acknowledge the positives that come from it, the success stories, those that demonstrate the transformative potential of the scheme when it works as intended. These positive stories we suddenly hear less of, well, because it's never really in the media's interest. But let's have a look. Take the story of a beekeeper from Queensland. This NDIS participant turned his passion for beekeeping into a thriving business. With over 130 hives produced honey and beeswax products, he now sells his creations at local markets. Here, the NDIS played a key role in supporting this participant's entrepreneurial journey. The scheme helped him fund specialized equipment and tools, ensuring he could work safely and independently despite his disability. It also provided transport support, enabling him to manage his hives across remote locations and offering skill development opportunities that allowed him to grow his business knowledge and improve operations. What makes the story even more inspiring is his vision for inclusivity as he plans to expand his operations. He is now looking to employ other NDIS participants in his beekeeping business, creating meaningful work and opportunities for people with disabilities in his community. This is a true success story highlighting NDIS potential and empowering individuals to overcome barriers, pursue their passion, and contribute meaningfully to their communities. So let's wrap this up. The NDIS is a system that has brought hope, empowerment, and dignity to countless Australians with disability. For many, it has been a life-providing support that enabled independence, connection, and opportunity. However, as we have explored today, this vision is increasingly at risk. The stories of families and individuals who've lost essential supports due to funding cuts are not isolated. They are part of a growing trend. These cuts are leaving participants struggling to maintain their progress, their independence, and even their basic quality of life. The government's focus on sustainability is understandable. Any program with the scale and ambition of the NDIS needs to be financially sound to remain viable for future generations. The intention to control costs is not inherently bad. It reflects a need to protect the program's longevity. But the way these changes are being implemented is more troubling. They prioritize budgetary metrics over human outcomes, often overlooking the long-term consequences of short-term savings. Cuts to early intervention therapies, personal care, and home modification, like in the example we have discussed today, may reduce costs now, but they increase the risks of expensive crisis interventions later down the line. These decisions lacked the nuanced person-centered thinking that the NDIS was built upon. That's all for today. Thank you so much for watching. Please like this video and subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you in the next one.